It's only a kick, a jump, a block. It's only a serve. It's only a tackle, a run. It's only for the fans. After all, it's only pressure. You got this. Adidas.
I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half-century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access.
Pardon me, but I got a fever. I've been diagnosed with March Madness. You probably have a case of it too. Most everyone does this time of year. You don't have to be a regular fan of college basketball to love the NCAA tournament. This special episode of Press Box Access will remind you why. We have 12 sports writers sharing stories from March Madness moments that they've covered since the 1970s. They've shared these memories on previous episodes, but they're especially potent when you put them together. Hearing them might make you smile or recall your past brackets that went up in flames. Let's start with Malcolm Moran. He's covered more than 40 Final Fours. Malcolm, why did the NCAA tournament grow to capture our imagination?
I think a lot of it has to do with the vision of a small number of people, and I will apologize in advance if I'm missing any, but the first two that come to mind are unfortunately no longer with us. Dave Gavitt, whose vision created the Big East.
Right.
And Tom Jernstedt, who was the NCAA official who basically oversaw the development of the Final Four. And in many ways, the event that we see now bears a lot of his vision. And specifically what I'm referring to is the increase in size from about 24 or 25 in the mid to late 70s to the 64-team field in 1985, which meant that every corner of the country probably has some rooting interest.
That's a great point, yeah.
You might be rooting against them, but the tournament was going to reach people where they lived in a much different way with a 64-team field than it would have when, you go back to the early to mid 70s, you think of what an injustice it was when only one team from a conference could play in the NCAA tournament.
Oh, right. Maryland, 1974, right? Triple overtime.
Right. Well, and that's when that whole issue really came to a head, when Maryland losing to North Carolina State and David Thompson in one of the great ACC tournament games ever, and doesn't get an NCAA tournament bid and wound up not accepting an NIT bid because they were so crushed.
Yeah.
Now it when it went to 64, especially, it became a much more democratic lowercase d event.
So what?
And the opportunity became, national on a true national scale.
Malcolm took us back 50 years by referencing the ACC tournament title of 1974. That's when North Carolina State defeated Maryland 103-100 in overtime. The Wolfpack, led by the soaring David Thompson, went on to win the national championship by stunning Bill Walton and UCLA in double overtime. Mark Whicker was at that game. He tells us why both NC State wins were pivotal for college basketball.
Yeah, I went to Chapel Hill and got out in 73, and then I worked for a year for the Chapel Hill paper. And then in 74, I got a job as a columnist in Winston-Salem. But that famous 74 team, I was working in Chapel Hill at the time, and I was at the game where they beat UCLA and Greensboro. But anyway, I was at the UCLA game, and which was astounding and to watch, but it was very historic. And, that state team lost one game in 2 years. They were undefeated in 1973, but they were also on probation, so they didn't get to go anywhere. But, you tell people about David Thompson today, and they really don't know who you're talking about. But he's, as far as culturally, socially, everything, he was the most important player in ACC history. He came along at a time when integration was underway, but wasn't really fully established yet. And it was still, it was sort of unthinkable that anybody would have a black coach or a black quarterback even in the ACC. Well, that's not true. There were a couple of black quarterbacks before him, but Thompson was the guy who everybody loved. And I think he did a lot for relations between the races in North Carolina. And he was just a phenomenal, spectacular basketball player for his time because of his leaping ability. And, those are the days when you couldn't dunk because they had a no dunk rule.
Right.
And his last regular season game, he just said he was in the game at the end and they were up by about 25 and he just said, screw it, and went up for a lob and slammed it, and everybody went crazy. And, those were great teams. And that state team was hard to match up with because they had a great player in Thompson. They had a really good 5'6" point guard from Indiana named Monty Tao, who was a great shooter and a great distributor. And then they had Tommy Burleson, who was 7'4" and might not have looked pretty all the time, but he was extremely effective. And if he wanted to score, you really couldn't stop him. So it took a team like that to beat UCLA and end that, kind of end the Walton years. Didn't end the dynasty, but it ended the Walton years.
The next pivotal tournament moment occurred in 1979, the NCAA championship game. Magic Johnson and Michigan State versus Larry Bird and Indiana State. Dick Weiss, known by everyone as Hoops, covered that game and saw its impact.
It became a national event, Magic Bird, 1979. You had two bigger-than-life personalities. I mean, Indiana State was unbeaten. Magic had an unbelievable charismatic personality for an 18-year-old kid, 19-year-old kid. And I think people fell in love with the game, fell in love with the idea of playing a championship game. During that year when the game was held out in Salt Lake, and it just got bigger from there. Now, you better have $600 if you want to go to the games.
Yeah, right. I mean, basically, wait a minute. So the two guys who changed the NBA also changed college basketball.
I think so. And they made an immediate change.
From there, the popularity of the NCAA tournament grew with an assembly line of memorable moments. Malcolm Moran was there for many of them.
So there were so many iconic moments back in those days when you think about it. Keith Smart hitting a jumper, Lorenzo Charles, Chris Webber's timeout, Duke, Kentucky, UNLV, Duke. As a reporter, when you think about all those events that you were at, what comes to mind first and why?
Well, the part of this would be my own experience, but part of it would be the impact nationally. The sequence of games in 81 on the first Saturday of the tournament when you had a staggered series of lightning in a bottle moments, one of them being number one DePaul losing to St. Joe's at Dayton, which was a moment that we both observed in person. But you had other games as well. You had the U.S. Reed 40 or 50 footer, and there was another game. And the fact that the technology had evolved to that point that allowed NBC to cut from one moment to the next, and you had this succession of bolts of lightning. I mean, that clearly was a series of moments that took the national interest in that tournament to a new level.
Dick Jerardi found himself in the deadline house of pain a few times during the 25 Final Fours that he covered. One was in 2010 when Duke held off Butler 61-59 to win the championship.
Well, you mentioned the 1985 Final Four where St. John's, Villanova, and Georgetown were joined by Memphis, of all people. But three Big East teams in that Final Four, and that's obviously the scene where Villanova upset that mighty Georgetown team. Villanova being a Philly team, you're on the scene there in Lexington at Rupp Arena covering that game. That's one of the most famous games in college basketball history. What do you recall specifically about that game?
A bunch of stuff. It was a crazy day. The day of first of all, Villanova was an 8th seeded team in the tournament. The game before the Big East tournament, they lost to Pitt by 25 points on the road. And I think they needed to, and then they drew Pitt in the first round of the Big East tournament. I'm figuring if they don't win this game, this team's not going to go to the NCAA. And they win the game, and then they lose to St. John's because they could never beat St. John's in the semifinals. They get into the tournament, and they play 6 perfect games. I mean, they beat 3 number 1 seeds.
Wow, I forget that. 3 number 1 seeds.
Yeah, they beat Michigan, they beat Memphis, and they beat Georgetown. And on top of that, they beat 2 ACC teams. They beat Maryland, they beat Carolina. I mean, it was an unbelievable run, and they played 6 perfect games. You know, Rowley doesn't get enough credit, I think.
Rolly Massimino, the coach of the Wildcats.
Yeah, before the shot clock and before the 3-point shot, I think he was as good a coach as anybody, because if he got the lead and there were 4 minutes left, the game was over, because they just never made mistakes. They just spread the floor and made every key free throw. It was unbelievable. Nothing phased them. They had 3 seniors, the McLean brothers the McLeans and Eddie Pinckney, and they had all been through the Big East wars. They all were confident enough. They all knew each other from the time they were at 5-star camp. And they had Harold Presley and a guard named Harold Jensen, and it all fell together. I mean, look, in that game against Georgetown, they shoot 78 for the game, 90% for the second half. And it was like destiny. The day of the game, Al Severance, the old Villanova coach, passes away. He's down in Lexington, and he passes away. So that makes it hard. Jake Nevin, the old leprechaun who was the longtime trainer for Villanova, has ALS, and he's in a wheelchair. I mean, the game is coming down the stretch. It's a foul with like 20 seconds left. Harold Presley is going to the line to shoot 2 shots. He goes over, rubs Jake's head, and says, "These are for you, Jake." He made them both. Mm-hmm. After the game ends, you know, Georgetown was a 13-point favorite. No one thought Villanova had much of a chance, even though Villanova was competitive with Georgetown in both the regular season games. Eddie Pinckney and Dwayne McClain run over to press row, jump on press row, and the game was played on April 1st. And they start screaming, "April Fools, April Fools." It was great. I know I didn't sleep that night, and I think Rolly drank and smoked his way through the rest of the night. And the next day, I was able to hitch a ride back with Villanova on the team charter.
Yeah, didn't Rolly ask you to fly back to Philly with the team?
And I got John Feinstein on the plane too, because he wanted to come. And we get off the plane, and all of a sudden we're in the middle of a parade. I mean, it was great. In Philadelphia, which I think never really had the great affinity for Villanova, because Rolly recruited all these kids outside the city and hardly ever recruited kids in the city. But Philadelphia fell in love with Villanova for that day. And I still remember 2 months later, Villanova goes to the White House. And I still remember pinching myself and saying, did I dream this? Did this really happen as I walked through the gates and into the Rose Garden? It was unbelievable. I mean, it's something you never really forget.
Speaking of dreams, Jerry Tipton was covering Kentucky basketball as he did for 41 seasons when the Wildcats played in the Dream Game, Kentucky versus Louisville in the 1983 NCAA Mideast Regional Final. The Cardinals prevailed in overtime, 80-68. It was the first time in 24 years that they had played each other. It had been 61 years since they played in the regular season because Kentucky wouldn't schedule Louisville. The tournament forced them together in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Well, it was surreal. That would be the word I would use, because Louisville had been lobbying publicly for a series, start a series in Kentucky. You know, I think Kentucky, they cited a policy that wouldn't allow them to play Louisville in the regular season. So
When the
I asked them
Wildcats
for
played
a
in
copy of
the Dream
policy.
Game,
I wanted to read
Kentucky versus Louisville
And they-
in the
I think it was an
1983
open records
NCAA
request. I can't
Mideast
remember.
Regional
Sure.
Final.
But the
The
answer
Cardinals
was,
prevailed
well,
in
there's not a
overtime,
written
80-68.
Oh, it's
It's
verbal.
just, yeah, it's a policy with quotation marks, I guess, around it. And okay. And I remember, I believe it was CBS interviewed Joe B. Hall, I think during the season. And one of their questions was playing Louisville, and he walked away. End of interview. And so it was that touchy of a subject. And so for them to be playing, of course, you know, at the NCAA tournament, I don't care what, there's no policy there. Right. And they hadn't played since the 59 NCAA tournament. And so they played, I remember seeing the two teams. The governor, as you remember, wore a sport coat that was half blue and half red. Yeah, right. So he's staying neutral. And just to see the two teams on the court warming up for the game was unbelievable. You know, it was like the Israelis and the Palestinians were going to play a basketball game. And, you know, it just didn't seem like this was possible. Right. So anyway, they play. And, of course, Louisville wins in overtime. And, the so-called dream game. But it was such a great game, a memorable game, that the state legislature got involved, as you may remember. And the word got out that they were going to pass a law mandating Kentucky to play Louisville. Mm-hmm. And so they made an exception in the policy, and they played the next season, started a series, which continues to this day. Right. And they hadn't played I looked it up, they hadn't played this in the regular season since 1922. Wow. And so they played in 80, what would that be, 83, 84.
61 years.
Right. Yeah. So they played then, and it's been great. You know, the fans are, they're always engaged, but they're really, really engaged for that.
But when you're at a game like that 83 game, Kentucky-Louisville, do you actually feel like you're at more than a basketball game?
Yes. You feel like every once in a while, you feel like you're witnessing history. And that was the feeling with that game. That, that's something that's going to be remembered for a long, long time. And, I felt privileged to be there. And, everything about it was electric.
Because that was a very small arena, right?
Stokely, I want to say it had like maybe 10,000. Yeah. Not much more than that. It was very quirky. And, I remember there was a balcony behind one basket right there by it. And the seats along each sideline, they were very vertical, if I remember right. There wasn't a lot of tilt. I may have that wrong. But I love those old arenas like that had a lot of character. Barnhill Arena at Arkansas is like that, too. Mm-hmm. It's got it was maybe 8,000. And their fans are really into it, too. And the pep band was, everything was really charged up in a condensed atmosphere. That was great. That was super. That's my favorite arena, I think.
Right. By the way, the Kentucky-Louisville game, tip-off, 12:45. I looked it up. Think about that. Times were different.
I bet the deadline was like 8 o'clock or something.
Yeah, right. Sit around, you had plenty of time.
The magnitude of March can happen at any time in any round. Bud Withers, who covered 20 Final Fours and 73 NCAA tournament weekends, can attest.
And there were certainly great games in the Final Four, including Duke beating UNLV's unbeaten team in '91 in the semis.
Oh, hey, I was there. I was there for that one. We were both courtside. Yeah,
exactly. But you know what? I thinking about it, I kind of concluded that the moments that you really remember, or at least I do, in the tournament were those early round. The Tyus Edney coast to coast, 4.8 seconds left in 95 when UCLA overcame Missouri and by 1 point, and moments like that, and you start to think, boy, how history could have been different. I mean,
one play.
Yeah, one play. I mean, if Edney doesn't make that drive, it would now be 1975 since UCLA had won a national title, which is, what are we talking? That's 45 years ago.
Yeah, Jim Herrick would have never got that title under his belt as the UCLA coach. He still would have been the Lizard of Westwood.
But along those same lines, back in one of the first NCAA basketball games I covered back in '83 in Corvallis. NC State is playing Pepperdine in a first round game.
This is Jim Valvano. Valvano coaching NC State, right?
Absolutely. And Pepperdine's got them dead to rights. I believe the game went double overtime, but at the end of regulation, it was either at the end of regulation or the end of the first overtime. Pepperdine's got them, as I recall, by like 6 points with like 50 or 55 seconds left. And I still recall looking down to my left at the Pepperdine bench and guys celebrating. I mean, they're going to knock out NC State in the first round, and nobody's ever going to. I mean, how is Jim Valvano going to be remembered? Years later, and the V Foundation, would that have ever?
Yeah, because they
even happened.
Because NC State survived that game and then went on to win that miraculous national championship, which
exactly.
That's why we have the V Foundation.
Exactly, yeah. And NC State had a whole string of near misses, if you remember. I mean, they, so many times they could have been knocked out of that tournament, but the very first game, they should have been knocked out. Pepperdine had a kid who, Dane Suttle, who with like 40 seconds left had 2 free throws, and he was like an 84% free throw shooter, missed them both. I mean, probably if he makes one out of 2, and he's a great free throw shooter, NC State's going home.
He probably never missed 2 at the line in a row in his career.
I wouldn't think so. Yeah.
And a game like that wasn't even a big arena, right? That was like kind of a smaller place, wasn't it?
About 10,000.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Another one that I could mention, in '86, covering a regional in Long Beach, of all places, Montana State was in there, from the Big Sky, and they're a 16 seed, and they're playing St. John's with Walter Berry, number 1 seed and whatnot. And
Carnesecca's great teams. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, coming off. Let's see, that would have been a year after St. John's had been to the Final Four, and so anyway, Montana State had the collection of scruffy kids from rural Montana, and in a second, they gave St. John's a pretty good run. I mean, it just didn't have enough talent. But in the second half, Montana State had a couple of kids. Last name was Furch, Ferch, and the older kid, his name was Kral Furch, not Carl, but Kral, K-R-A-L, Furch, and the unlikely name. And so, sometime in the second half, he goes down the lane and he's like 6'4" and dunks on Shelton Jones, who's like a 6'8" kid. Just a nasty posterizing dunk. And it was such a great basketball moment, the idea that if you came from the inner city, you didn't necessarily have any edge on this guy from rural Montana.
Some guy named Crawl who had hops.
some guy named Crawl who could jump and who could dunk.
Well, that's what the tournament was great about, right? It was like sometimes you would have no-name schools or no-name players, and that was their stage to make a reputation for themselves.
Exactly, yeah. Well, just getting in the tournament for a school like that is a huge deal. And then they gave St. John's a pretty good run, probably lost by double digits eventually, but certainly didn't get blown out. But I'll never forget Crawl Furch.
Crawl Furch. I'd never heard of Crawl Furch, and now we know all about it. I wonder if Crawl even remembers that play. He probably has it framed in a museum somewhere, wherever he's living. And
Shelton Jones doesn't have it framed.
No, he does not. No.
You might not remember that Montana State team the way Bud Withers does, but you no doubt recall the 1983 NCAA championship game. North Carolina State and Houston, known as Phi Slama Jama. North Carolina State, in one of the all-time upsets, defeated Houston in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Tony Barnhart was sitting courtside.
It was incredible. My first memory about it goes back to the day before. There was a writer for the now deceased for the old Raleigh News and Observer, Carlton Tudor, who was just a wonderful character, wonderful writer. And we were all staying at the media. We were all staying at the Marriott in Albuquerque.
Wait a minute, hold on. Imagine that Sportswriters were staying at a Marriott.
Shock. Even then. Well, it's all about, Todd, you know this, it's all about getting the points.
You got to get those points.
You got to get the points. And so Carlton was going around the lobby with all these writers, and he's trying to get anybody, to pick NC State. And nobody will do it. Because you're talking about North Carolina State playing Phi Slama Jama, one of the greatest collections of basketball talent that has ever existed. And there's no way that North Carolina State can win this game. And so Carlton never found anybody to pick NC State, but I always remember that. And then when the game started, there was this incredible tension in the air, and it was an amazing thing to be a part of.
Yeah, tell us about being inside the arena. It was when you think about the Final Four now, it's in these giant football stadiums, but this was a basketball arena, and made for college basketball, really. And so the atmosphere fit the sport, if not what the event became. So what was it like inside there that night?
Well, the arena was so small they couldn't get all the media in there. The media workroom was literally outside of the building. They had to put it together over there. But the tension was great. Houston jumps out to an early lead, but what happened was that North Carolina State wore them down, and Guy Lewis, as somebody famously said, Guy Lewis fell asleep and woke up and thought he was Dean Smith running the four corners. What he had to do is he had to slow it down, because NC State didn't slow it down. NC State ran the ball, and Houston looks up, and there's 10 minutes to go in the game. They've got a little lead, but they're exhausted. So Guy Lewis slowed the game down to get his guys catch a break, and that enabled NC State to sort of hang around. And the finish was just incredible.
Did you think Wittenberg's shot had a chance to go in?
No. I was sitting there in mid-court up a few rows, and you could tell when it left his hand that it wasn't going to get there. But you're sitting there watching, and you see Lorenzo Charles just suddenly come out of nowhere and grab it and put it back. And, Todd, me being the calm, objective journalist that I am, I jumped up and when the ball went through and it was obvious what had happened, I said, son of a gun. Although I didn't say son of a gun, I said something else. They did it. I looked at my watch. I had exactly 25 minutes to make the first deadline. and away we went.
Exactly. Did you see Valvano running around the court?
I did. He was watching that whole thing. He's running for, as he says, he's running for somebody, find somebody to hug.
Yeah.
And it was, and the energy was just unbelievable. It was just the contrast. It was incredible noise down on NC State's end. And the Houston guys were just literally in shock. You can still see the images of guys beaten on the floor. I mean, it was you're talking about Akeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler and, Larry Michaud and all these guys. It was just an incredible basketball team. But NC State, to Valvano's credit, he had a veteran team with Wittenberg and Lowe and Thurl Bailey, and they hung in there and found ways to win. That was an incredible team to cover, period. A lot of people don't remember this. Derek Wittenberg broke his foot in December and was out for a long, long time, and the team just went down. Wittenberg comes back, and they still haven't adjusted, but they finally figured it out. And, of course, the national championship game was the big one. But the one when they had to win the ACC tournament just to get to the NCAA basketball tournament.
Right.
And they did, and they beat Ralph Sampson in the finals of the tournament, and then beat them again in the regional finals. You talk about a team that was meant to win the national championship. That was NC State in '83.
It sure looked like Memphis was meant to win the national championship in 2008. The Tigers led Kansas by 9 points with only 2 minutes left in the game. And then they collapsed. The game went into overtime. Memphis took the L. Geoff Calkins, typing on press row.
Can you put us in that place? Memphis is winning, I think, by 9 or 11. 11 with 2 minutes to go. 11. You've got a column due because you're the Memphis guy. What the hell was it like for you on deadline when all of a sudden Kansas comes scrambling back and Mario Chalmers hits a three at the top of the key to force overtime?
It's gutting, not because it's Memphis losing. It's because what happens is that, I was never great on deadline. Some people are wonders on deadline. And I was never great on game columns on deadline. It just, I would, the old Red Smith line, open up a vein and bleed. Like, that's sort of what I was like. And so, but you're working on 2 columns. Like, you really, I think the deadline was 10 minutes after, and on the one, it's Memphis finally wins a championship after all these years of Larry Finch and that team in 72, 73, losing to Bill Walton, and then the Dana Kirk team that went to the Final Four, and now here finally with John Calipari and Derrick Rose and Chris Douglas Roberts, they're going to win a championship for a city that really had never had a championship of any sort. So you're trying to capture that in one file. And then you have this crushing loss, whatever it is, you're in the other file. And yes, you're putting in live stuff that's happening along the way, but you're really building 2 separate columns. And with about 3 minutes left, you realize Memphis is going to win. So you abandon the lose column and you just focus on writing the civic celebration column. And then Mario Chalmers hits that shot and you just, curse. It's impossible because there's no way you can, I can't capture this in 7 minutes or 13 or whatever. I don't remember how many it was. I actually did. I said, at that point I called and I said, you got to give me an extra 10 minutes or something here. And
did they give it to you?
Yeah, I got an extra 10 minutes. It was a big event, but it was, I have, oh God, what an awful, it was cliche in the end. But
it will survive in advance, even for the writers.
It was just absolute hell. It was absolute hell. There's just no other way to describe it. And even now, when something happens in any big game and I'm not there, that's that dramatic, you just feel for the people in the press box.
Oh, yeah, that's a natural reaction. I've been out of the business for 6 years, and if I am watching a game late at night and something does happen, my first thought is, those poor bastards.
Exactly right. It's those poor bastards. That's just true.
Dick Jerardi found himself in the deadline house of pain a few times during the 25 Final Fours that he covered. One was in 2010 when Duke held off Butler 61-59 to win the championship?
Yeah, probably a couple. Gordon Hayward was literally dribbling right in front of me when he took that shot against Duke for Butler, that if it had gone in, the half-court shot would have won the championship.
Looked like it was going in.
It did. I had that great view where he was. I could, when you're behind the ball and you can look at the trajectory and you're going, hey, that has a chance. And of course, it just missed. That one, and for me, the next one for the Final Four is obviously the Kris Jenkins shot for Villanova in 2016. We had between the Inquirer and us at the time, we'd kind of combined staffs at that point. We had, 12 people there, whatever. So I was writing a column that night, and I had written the column, most of it, on the theory that Villanova was going to win the game because they had taken control of the game late and had like a 10-point lead. And as you know, when you're sitting on deadlines, and that was a deadline game for me, you got it right while the game's going on. So I have it done, and everything is good. Now all of a sudden, North Carolina makes a couple crazy plays. That's why Marcus Page hits a crazy three. It's a tie game. And I'm thinking, all right, well, there's only one really bad thing that can happen here. If North Carolina steals the ball and scores, then I'm totally screwed. I got nothing because I got like 2 minutes left. But they don't steal the ball. Villanova gets it in. Ryan Arcidiacono, their point guard from the Chamonix High School, which is right down from where I live, flips it back to Kris Jenkins, and the ball's in the air, and the buzzer goes off, and it's in. And I have like 2 minutes to file this column. And the good news is I already have Villanova winning. I had a lead. I changed about 2 things, and then I had another hour to write it correctly, which I was able to do, go out on the court and talk to some players and put some perspective on it. And I remember calling into the desk, and I said, look, how much space do I have? They said, just keep writing until you get tired. I said, sounds good.
You always want to hear that as a writer.
Yeah, that's kind of how we did it back.
There's no problem identifying one of the greatest plays in NCAA tournament history: Grant Hill's pass to Christian Laettner and Christian Laettner's shot to beat Kentucky in the 1992 East Regional Final. Mike DeCourcy remembers exactly where he was sitting while covering Duke's 104-103 overtime victory.
I was sitting exactly behind the Kentucky bench on the for the camera position. It's the near side of the court. They're shooting in. I believe that's where. It was. I was on the near side of the court. Usually they shoot into benches, but in this case they were not. So I was on the side of the court where if you were looking at it, Grant Hill was throwing from the right to the left, and that's where I was behind the Kentucky bench. And it's funny because I remembered being there, and then during the pandemic when CBS was showing old tournament games to cover the time because they didn't have anything else to show, there was one timeout that you could see me, and I froze it on my DVR and took a picture of it and put it on Facebook because that's where I thought I was, and there I was, and I was looking a lot younger then too.
Wendell Barnhouse was also courtside for Laettner's famous shot. The sights and sounds inside the old Spectrum from 30 years ago still resonate with him.
I was probably second row of press row, beyond the baseline, and Laettner was down there. So if I'd have had my binoculars, I'd have been in great shape. But I was about as far away on press row from Laettner as you could be. And that was one of those games where it was over, and it's the greatest, craziest game you ever covered. And you sit there, and I was just how I don't know how to write this. I don't know what to say, because it was a game that had 2 game-winning shots. Kentucky scores with 2.1 seconds on a great drive,
right?
To take the lead, and then Laettner kills them with his shot. So you had in the space of just over 2 seconds, you had 2 game-winning shots. And it was Kentucky was a great story because they had been
finish. It wasn't just the end, right? So as the game was unfolding,
you had all these guys that nobody wanted playing on this team.
Grasp that this was
it's like
a normal day.
Oh yeah, I knew it was. I'm sitting there. It was the previous year. Actually, I'd seen Duke get run out of the gym by UNLV in 1990, then come back and upset them in the semifinals the next year, which, again, an unbelievably great game that nobody thought Duke had a chance to win. And here they are trying to become the first repeat since UCLA. And I had written during the season, they're not going to do it. You got 6 games of 40 minutes. There's going to be a 5-minute stretch where you're not going to have it. And, I was out there saying, and so I didn't want to write,
the replay
particularly, but I just thought it's too tough to win 6 games in 2 consecutive final NCAA tournaments. So, yeah. Again, sometimes, when you're seeing a replay of the play 100 times, it's easy. But when you're sitting there watching it live, I didn't, I say, here's Grant Hill taking the pass out of bounds. He's Calvin Hill's son. Okay, he's a great sophomore. It's like, oh, okay, well, I didn't look at whether or not guarding the inbounder, which a lot of people criticize Pitino for. And it's like, what? I guess they're going to try to get the ball to Laettner, but again, it's just like, I think honestly at the time I was just like, I was kind of blanking out, not really. I was just kind of watching what's going to happen. I didn't analyze it. And it's like, oh my God, he hit the shot.
What was it like in the arena?
It was so, one of those things where something happens in a blink of an eye and you blinked and you kind of like, I don't know what happened. It was bedlam. It was, people were going crazy. And another thing that I didn't realize later, there's this great shot that from CBS right after Laettner's shot, which I think embellishes and shows what March Madness is about. Thomas Hill, one of Duke starters, was not on the floor for the shot. And there's a picture of him on the sideline, and he's like this, and it's like, but it's like they lost. It's almost like he's in tears from that half-second shot of him. He can't believe they made the shot, but it's almost like if you just saw that, you'd say, well, that guy's team lost. But obviously, I went to the press conferences. I went to the Duke locker room, and tried to get what I could. And I was I'm being totally honest. I'd been doing it for a while, covering college basketball. I honestly didn't know what to do. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to. I remember sitting in the press room, looking at my laptop, and I asked the desk, I said, can I do a little sidebar in addition to my game story? Because I wanted to cover as much as I could. Mm-hmm. And I was just sitting there thinking, I don't know where to start. I don't know what I'm going to. And the funny thing was, I've gone back and read my story. It wasn't that bad.
Wendell wasn't the only writer who found it hard to find the right words inside the spectrum that night in Philadelphia. Jerry Tipton, the Kentucky beat writer covering the game, still thinks about the struggle of telling that immediate story.
When you think about that game, do you remember what your feeling was when the game ended and you had to write?
I was overwhelmed. I felt inadequate to the task. I was just like, lost. What do I do? And I remember wondering, should I go to the formal press conferences with the coaches? And I guess they brought players. I think they did. Or go to the locker room. And nowadays, I went to the press conference and it was fine. It was what it was. But I wish I had gone to the locker room because I think the emotions were raw. And I think that would have been the place to be, to try to capture the emotional tidal wave that game was.
Why did it feel overwhelming? What was it about it?
It was just the magnitude of it. Duke's, I think they were number 1, but they were the defending national champion. Kentucky, and I don't think I captured this very well, but this was the pinnacle of a 3-year rebuilding operation by Rick Pitino. He came in 89-90, as you know. And the program was on probation, no tournament in 90 and 91. And they got good. They had the best record in the SEC his second year, but they were ineligible to win the championship. So, but 91, 92 was their first year back as eligible for the tournament, and they were Kentucky again. Kentucky was Kentucky, a contender to win the national championship. They played Duke, the defending champion. The game goes into overtime. They make a shot with 2.1 seconds left. And, of course, you know the rest. But I remember one little thing that I'm proud of is that my seat was near, it was about the top of the key on the end of the court for the inbounds pass. And that Grant Hill threw, if I remember right. And I noticed that Kentucky did not guard the inbounder. They had two guys on Laettner. Unfortunately for Kentucky, they both played behind him. So he had an easy way to catch the ball. And they were both shorter than him. So there wasn't a big chore to turn. Mashburn had fouled out, Jamal Mashburn. And so it happened, like right in my living room, so to speak. And I remember seeing Mike Krzyzewski go up to Kaywood Ledford. It was Kaywood Ledford's last game.
Yeah, legendary Kentucky announcer.
Yeah, legendary announcer, 39 years. And he was an icon. You talk about an icon. He was an icon. And I remember when Sean Woods made the shot with 2.1 seconds left, a bank straight in front of the basket, about maybe 7-8 feet. I don't know how often you can do that. You know what I mean? But he did it. And Ralph Hacker was the color man on the radio broadcast of Kentucky. And he was kind of like getting into celebratory mood. And Kaywood calmed him down and pointed out the game's not over yet. And, of course, then the inbounds to Laettner. He makes the shot. Krzyzewski comes to the radio stand there and says some kind words to Kentucky fans who are listening on the radio, which was nice. And then I remember hearing, not live, but hearing about, that Kaywood ended his broadcast by quoting the poet John Greenleaf Whittier, that about the saddest words of pen and tongue are, "It might have been." And I just thought, man, I wish I could go out. I didn't think it then, but since then, what a classy, great way to bow out, quoting a poet.
Right. Yeah, what a way. Cable was such a, he was the voice of Kentucky basketball.
He was a pro, too. Right. He brought an objectivity to it, which I admired. You could sort of tell, if Kentucky won, that was good. He wanted, he liked that. But he was a professional broadcaster at the same time.
Right. What do you remember about the game besides the obvious Laettner shot? Is there just things that, as the game unfolded, did you realize you were watching what became known as the greatest game in college basketball?
Not as well as I wish I had. It was obviously a riveting game. And, it held your attention. And, it was rich with storyline possibilities. But, my instinct, especially then, was, and it continued, was not to overdo it. I tried to stay within certain bounds. And I've second-guessed that many times as I've reflected on that game. I wish I had gone overboard. And I remember it was in Philadelphia, and the next morning at the Philadelphia airport, we're going to fly back, and I'm reading like the Philly paper, and they went full tilt on what a historic, and I'm kicking myself, saying, man, I wish I had gone more towards, just let myself be overwhelmed in the story.
Hoops Weiss not only recalls Laettner's shot, but also the days that followed.
They call timeout, and I go up, and my wife is in the stands with this little old white-haired lady, and she's going, now, nothing can happen in 2.5 seconds. Showing what I know. I'm one of those people who, in retrospect, still thinks they should have guarded the inbounds pass, because it's funny, earlier that year, Duke had played Wake Forest, and they guarded Grant Hill on the inbounds pass in a similar situation. Grant Hill threw it out of bounds. But that was the perfect pass, the perfect catch. It was like destiny. But I love the fact that normally Kentucky likes to celebrate teams that win, and they're unbelievable at remembering chapter and verse on everything that happened in a game. Heck, I got down there, people were telling me about the 1958 national championship game with a fiddle and five, and they knew everything. I mean, I felt like Johnny Cox was my next door neighbor. But, I mean, get back to Lexington, and Rick says, you got to come back down, because I was just going to stay home, because I live in Philadelphia.
Right.
And I moved all my stuff home, and he said, you got to come back Tuesday. I came back Tuesday, and they hung the 4 kids' jerseys in the rafter, and that was a special night. And it really put Kentucky basketball in perspective for me. I mean, the appreciation for what they did for the university. Now, God forbid, they haven't won a championship since 12. I'm sure last year they were ready to hang the coach.
And we all expect the NCAA tournament to deliver thrills like few other sporting events. It usually does. We hope the stories shared by these sports writers brought back some of your own favorite March Madness memories. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Hi, listeners. We wanted to take a moment to tell you about another podcast from Evergreen Podcasts and Sound Talent Media called Pit Lane Parlay. Pit Lane Parlay is the go-to podcast for IndyCar and motorsports-related news. Each episode, we discuss things like our favorite drivers, news clips from the last week, and generally giving each other a hard time about predictions we've made in the past and or life stories that have come up recently. We really have a lot of fun with it and really enjoy each other's company, and we hope you can come join us too. Join Pit Lane Parlay by following us on your favorite podcast today.